On today's World Insight, a bumpy start for China-U.S. relations under the Biden administration, though trade is high on the agenda of a phone call between the Chinese vice premier and the new U.S. trade representative. And word to the wise from well-known U.S. expert Joseph Nye. The success of Biden's China policy depends on how the United States changes.
Managed strategic competition, or what I call a cooperative rivalry.
And the upcoming Tokyo Olympics in limbo, following a U.S. advisory against travel to Japan due to COVID variants. After a year of Olympic delays, is it game or no game?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The Tokyo Olympic Games just weeks away. Japan faces a double whammy over the worsening pandemic and logistical challenges to holding the sports event. The latest troubling sign for the event came Monday when the U.S. State Department advised the U.S. citizens against traveling to Japan due to rising COVID infections in the country. But the organizers last week declared that they had entered what they coined operational delivery mode for the Summer Games, a clear signal that they will push ahead with the opening ceremony set for July the 23rd in Tokyo, regardless of the state of the pandemic. Now, it's the big question everyone is asking. The one that won't go away. Will the Tokyo Olympics indeed happen this summer and on time? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the upcoming Tokyo Olympics, we are joined in Tokyo, Kato Yoshikatsu, Adjunct Associate Professor with Asia Global Institute from University of Hong Kong. In New York, Mike Bacco, Sports Editor of the DailyNational.com. Last but not least in Beijing, Paul Dong, co-founder of EI Asia, Cultural Business in Art and Sports. Great to see all of you, gentlemen. Haven't seen you for a while because the geopolitics are being very busy these days in the world. So let's focus on sports. Well, not necessarily away that much from politics. I want to start by asking, so how much do you see the possibility that the Summer Olympics is going to be still held on time in Tokyo? Mr. Kato, I guess you have the best to say in this regard.
Yes, now our government is preparing for holding the Olympics game still. But the problem is now our public opinion, Japanese citizens are very collectively against the holding Olympics, so because due to the pandemic. So I think the problem is now how to achieve the success of Olympics game and the safety and health of Japanese citizens. So now I think now there are great concerns on that. So I do not think Japanese government and our citizens have agreed on that. So, and including some recent move from the U.S. government to be, against traveling to Japan or something like that. So I think now the situation is still very critical moment and complicated.
Mr. Bacco, if I understand, the U.S. official stance is not necessarily encouraging citizens to travel to Japan, to Tokyo, but not against the Tokyo Summer Olympics, right?
Yes, exactly. So they're not encouraging civilians to travel. They're not encouraging family members of the Olympic athletes to travel. But that wasn't really the plan all along. The plan was to have those Olympic athletes travel, to have their own doctors and nurses travel with the Olympic teams, and to perform their own tests, not only before they left, but upon arrival and during the games. So it's going to be a big effort and a big undertaking by all of the nations that send the athletes, but particularly when it comes to the US, they already have a plan and strategy in place. And if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, they actually may be in a better position than some of the other countries that have the resources that are able to do their own testing.
Mr. Dong, from Beijing's perspective, Beijing Winter Olympics beginning early next year, 2022. So what is Beijing's attitude now toward the Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo?
And I think, well, you know how passionate normally the Chinese athletes and coaches and officials are about participating in the Olympic Games or any international event, because China, relatively speaking, I mean, compared with the US or Japan, is a late, relatively newcomer to the Olympic family, and China cannot wait to, you know, participate every edition of the Olympics, despite the unfortunate, you know, delay of the Tokyo Games. I think at this moment, despite all the discussion or even dispute about, you know, potential cancellation, I think almost everyone on the Chinese delegation or potential Chinese teams cannot even think about have it canceled again.
So let's chop down, you know, some of the segments about this very complicated relationship involved in any Olympic Games. Now, there is the relationship between the host country and the IOC and host country and all the other countries that are participating in the Olympic Games. There is also tremendous commercial interest involved with IOC and also its, shall I say, sponsors, as well as sponsors with the host country. Now, there's also tremendous interest of athletes, their own sponsors, their home country, and also there's, of course, the sports issue, the competition, you know, for the honor and everything. Now, there's another one, the health issue as a result of COVID-19. So how do you see, you know, the competitions among all these issues? And with the current decision that the Summer Games continues, which do you think among all these factors are playing a leading role now, Mr. Bako?
Well, I think the biggest thing that is binding all of those entities that you just mentioned is the financial aspect of everything. You're thinking about $15 billion that have already been poured into these Olympic Games. And those are the official numbers. So those numbers are probably even more inflated. So right now, what both the IOC, what the nation is trying to get back, also from a media rights standpoint, there are a lot of entities that have billions of dollars on the line. So that's what's really driving this forward. And then you mentioned a very important part of it. The athletes, even last summer, during the height of the crisis, there were athletes that still wanted to go and compete because they know as Olympic athletes, their window is very small. There's a lot of money on the line for everyone.
Yeah, billions of dollars are at stake now. And I still see this as an opportunity, but if not an opportunity, but a moment that you cannot postpone anymore for the IOC to think about if with Tokyo and then Beijing, we can start a transition experiment, although it has very high risk, and to face the future scenario or landscape with the Olympic Games, for it to be put together very differently. If you look at the list of the sponsors, most of them are relatively, you know, more traditional sponsors or enterprises or companies. But now the richest companies who do have the deepest pockets in the world are very different. They are technology companies, and they can help the IOC or the entire International Olympic family to start reforming the format. I mean, almost everything about how humankind can do their physical activities, extravaganza, in a new way.
Interesting.
So these technological collaborating potential partners can do a lot, even financially, because they have the money.
Money, money, money. Is that still the money issue, Mr. Kato?
Yes. At the end of the day, IOC will make a decision, you know, whether to hold the Olympic Games on time. And now the Japanese government is preparing for that and supporting for that, you know, completely. But the problem is, previous guest pointed out money. You know, Olympics could create, you know, economic, financial, even peaceful impact. But, you know, now it's a century of a crisis, the pandemic. And of course, it's undeniable that the Japanese government has not successfully contained the spread of the pandemic. So Japanese government has a huge responsibility on that. And that is why our citizens could not fully support our government to hold that. So this is a very great pity and very unfortunate reality. But I think at the end of the day, as you mentioned, it's a great competition, great dilemma, among our sponsorship, our sportsmanship, our government, and the Olympic spirit. So this is a central dilemma. But from the perspective of Japanese, I think the health, safety issue couldn't be sacrificed.
Why is Japan's rate of vaccination so low? Will the government be able to motivate the public to do that before the Olympic Games? If you look at the clock right now, if they do it now in large amount, there is still time. But 2 weeks away from now, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, almost impossible. I have to say, because of our incapability and mismanagement, Japanese could not have created our own vaccine, right? And now the rate of vaccination is still very low, and including some operation, who are entitled to be vaccinated or something like that. Actually, I am not vaccinated yet, right? So a lot of people are in Queen. So this management and operation are very in chaos. So in this situation, how could we organize the Olympics game successfully? Maybe we could limit to some athletes or volunteers and to guarantee their safety. But after holding Olympics game, how could you, Japanese government, how could you guarantee the safety of Japanese citizens?
I'm sure the athletes, they're going to live in bubbles, right? There's going to be one kind of bubble after another kind of bubble and another kind of bubble. Everybody with different jobs, different functions will be in different bubbles, and they're not likely to interact. But still, they are facing enormous amount of risks. Mike, your thoughts about this?
And I think one of the other things that it speaks to is that all of this environment of being inside of bubbles, if we really want to think about the Olympic spirit, let's say, if you really want to believe in that and get past the dollars and the cents and the winning of the medals, is being in the Olympic Village and meeting other athletes from other countries, from other sports. So that idea of everyone being together, well, now with the Olympic Village, everyone's going to be sequestered even more so. So that Olympic spirit, for whatever that's worth, that's completely out the window. Now everyone's going to be in bubbles. There's going to be anywhere between 50 and 60,000 tests done per day. They're looking at upwards of 500 to 600 medical staff between doctors and nurses to complete those tests. And that's just the test that the Olympic Committee is planning on doing, let alone the individual countries that are sending their athletes. So this is something that when you really boil it down, countries, teams even within, and athletes even within those countries and those Olympic teams that they sent are going to be sequestered away from each other. You even may see the gymnastics team not being anywhere close to each other because they don't want some sort of cross-contamination or spread, or God forbid, the entire team gets wiped out. So those are the sorts of concerns that no one really wants to face, but that's going to be the reality of these Olympic Games.
This has never been the experience of the Olympic Games earlier. Mr. Dong, from outside, how is that likely to be done? And will Olympics still be Olympics?
It is indeed unprecedented. There were cancellations of the Olympic Games. Almost all of them were during wartime, but this is during peacetime. All those bubbles, sporting bubbles we talked about, have to abide by local laws to go ahead. But does Japan have any particular rule on this to counter the idea for the IOC to press ahead with the Olympics? I'm not sure because, like we mentioned about how the US government would, recommend their athletes when they plan to travel to Japan, that is based on local regulations applying to the entire community. And it's not a tradition for most of these governments to give the Olympians, the athletes representing the country, to have exclusive rights, very different from what's applied to the rest of the community.
Right.
Even China, I think they will treat their delegates almost the same as the rest of the population. So it's unimaginable. We are aware that the human resources shortage, especially shortage of medical staff, is very severe, and we're still waiting for the IOC to give any reliable plan to see that the gap is being narrowed significantly in the run-up to the opening of the games.
You know, this is not going to be one event that is going to face the danger of COVID-19. According to many of the epidemiologists that we've been talking to over the past year or so, this is going to be with us for quite some time. We know the vaccines work so far, but the variants could always be challenges to the vaccines, and we do not know simply just about the answer, which means if this Tokyo Olympic Games is being held on time, it could be both lessons and experiences for other sports events in the world. What we are thinking about the soccer games in different parts of the continent, and also the upcoming Winter Olympics in Beijing. On that, I want to go to you, Paul. You're based in Beijing. You know China is really geared up. The country has been, quite successful in dealing with COVID-19, opened up already for almost a year or so. How do you see, the country looking at the Olympic Games in Tokyo and thinking about, what's going to happen in Beijing?
Tianwei, I think I can tell that Beijing and the rest of China are probably even more supportive for the Tokyo Games to go ahead than the Japanese people themselves. And of course, for their athletes to have this rare opportunity to compete and for their career success. But at the same time, China has adopted a very different system of mitigating and containing the virus over the past year. But, Japan had been successful for a year until recently. But I think for sports, the Olympics, it has been overdue, the question or challenge for the Olympic family to think about, even before the pandemic.
True.
I think the Olympic movement has already come to a point to think about how to do it differently, because this was talked about being unable to sustain for quite a while. Beijing was already the biggest in terms of scale and scope. And London and Rio were experimenting some different ways. But finally, the pandemic pushed this forward for us to think about how the Olympic Games should be played out differently. So I think now the Chinese, compared with soccer and all other sporting events, the Olympic Games is so different. Within one city or surrounding one city with a couple of other suburban areas, you have to accommodate dozens of sports, more than 100 events to take place. The Olympic Games, you cannot, once you have a badminton problem, you cannot hire soccer officials to badminton to take it over.
Yeah.
So my question is, will the IOC be open enough, because the sports are somewhat separated from one another? If there is something happening to one sport, can the IOC just close out that particular sport while watching the rest or allowing the other sports to go ahead?
There are a
just
whole
like UEFA
yeah. I mean,
to-
Paul, you're only mentioning one of those questions. There are a long list of questions I could ask right now about how Olympic Games are likely to be held in the future, whether it is really going to be the Olympic Games that we know, right? Whether it is going to be, all in the same place or different places, whether it's going to be held more digitally or rather in person. All of these questions, and I'm sure many more, needs to be asked and can't be asked. Whether the money are being spent at the right place, whether health will be a big issue, whether other possibilities, unpredictabilities should be planned into the overall game. There are a lot of issues. Mike, your thoughts also on that?
Well, I think the future of the games, you're seeing it necessarily in the present. The next two summer games being held in Paris and being held here in the United States in Los Angeles, one of the reasons why those two countries were able to win those bids was because they had infrastructure. They're not building from scratch. You hear this term when it comes to Olympic cities, where they talk about the white elephants. They talk about these big Olympic centers and stadiums and venues. Think about all the venues, from an aquatic center to soccer fields to gymnastics arenas and basketball arenas, that then afterwards don't get used. You look at the past games like in Athens and in Rio, there are just abandoned stadiums around these countries. The same problem holds for the World Cup to a certain degree. Beijing has done an amazing job. Obviously, the Bird's Nest will be the Olympic Stadium again. They've retrofitted a lot of the other venues that were taking place, but that's really an outlier. So many of these other countries have not been able to do that. Here in the States, like we were saying, Los Angeles, they're going to have the Olympic opening ceremony in the track and field at Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. That's where they held the Olympics, I believe, in 1932 or 1936.
But on the other hand, Mike, there's a political correct question also, and also there's an issue of equality, isn't it? When you have countries much more advanced and having more sports facilities compared to those who don't, but you still want to give those who didn't have an opportunity earlier to have, be a member of the Olympic host countries. So that is another issue. There are a lot of issues for any of the move likely to take place in terms of changing our plan, Mike.
Well, certainly, but when you do think about those countries that, let's say, you want to give them a shot, or they're a developing country, then there are so many other questions that become involved in terms of, should they be spending 10 to 15, possibly even $20 billion to host an Olympic Games that ultimately, when you look at all the economic numbers, does it bring in revenue if you do have people that are traveling there? Right. Yes, but it is a small, finite amount of an opportunity. That's one of the challenges for the Tokyo Games in terms of no spectators and no foreign travelers. That would have been hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue coming in. Now, all of that is wiped out from a ticket sales standpoint, from people coming in, possibly coming and seeing the nation for the first time and making a return trip. So there are many questions that are involved.
Olympic Games have never been short of controversies, isn't it? Until everything is in chaos, in controversies almost, until the sports extravaganza begins. Then everybody will be head over heels in love with all the sportsmen and sports activities being demonstrated over there. But last, also comments coming from Yoshikatsu, please.
In terms of the Olympic spirit, peace should be a key word. But now, looking ahead in the future, more crisis would become like today. So now I'm wondering whether Japan could prepare some alternatives. For example, now due to the weather issue, we are going to hold our marathon game in Hokkaido, the coolest place in Japan. But now Tokyo is still under state of emergency. In this situation, whether Japan could prepare something alternative or something unique and organize it differently. So this should be some preparation for future crisis, very uncertain crisis. I'm not going to say which kind of crisis can happen, but given some lessons from this moment in Tokyo, in the future, we need to be ready for some alternative or uniqueness, doing that differently. Okay. So maybe this is going to be some lesson from Tokyo Olympics game.
Yoshikazu Kato, Mike Bako, Paul Dong, thank you so much for being with us.